Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed your short break, and I'm really pleased that we're moving straight into our next session. I've really been enjoying seeing the interaction and the questions coming in, so please keep that going. Now we're going to talk about planning and supporting resilient communities, and we're living in a time when resilience is a word we use every day. It's part of our everyday lives. And if you think about growth areas' experiences in recent times, not only have we all managed to live with COVID and the impact of COVID on unemployment and mortgage stress and all of those things we saw in our communities, but a lot of our member councils have also been dealing with bushfires and floods and other natural disasters. However, we all keep going, don't we? And we know that houses are being built in growth areas at rates never seen before, partly or mainly due to home builder. The economic stimulus package from the federal government, building approvals are up 34% on average in growth area councils. So we'll see local government having an ever-increasing role to play in supporting new and existing communities in both good and difficult times. So today we'll hear two great case studies on how councils are approaching resilience, and then we will be joined in a panel discussion with a Life Course Centre representative, Dr. Rosemary Cale, who is the Chief Investigator of the Early Years Initiative Evaluation. So first presentation in this session, Building Community Resilience in New and Emerging Communities. Please welcome Nick Adams, Research and Advocacy Officer at Mitchell Shire Council, an emerging growth area on the far north of metropolitan Melbourne, and Fiona Ryan, a Senior Strategic Planner at neighbouring city of Whittlesea. Just to note, Rebecca Siriani from Mitchell Shire Council will join us on the panel session as she also worked on this project. Nick and Fiona will talk about a project that I think has enormous potential to really have an impact across the country. And if you look on the website, look at Fiona and Nick's bios, connect with them, because I'm sure that many of you will be wanting to know more about this project. So for now, I'll hand over to Nick and Fiona.
Thank you for that, Bronwyn. I'll just share my screen as we have a presentation. Hopefully that's up for everyone now. As Bronwyn mentioned, the presentation we have is regarding a report looking at building resilience in new and emerging communities, and in particular the need for a planning response with regards to this. This was a report funded by the Northern Metropolitan Partnership in Victoria, and it was a partnership between three councils of Mitchell, Whittlesea and Hume, who led this piece of work along with the K2 consultancy. This piece of work was really looking at, from an open-minded perspective, at an approach to understanding how we can actually look at building and protecting resilience in new and emerging communities with a particular focus in growth areas. This research was looking at addressing how the planning system in particular can better support local governments to achieve and protect this resilience. And it was focused on the relationship between the health, well-being and safety of the community, the accelerated development of resilience in new and emerging communities, and strategies that would simultaneously promote community resilience and minimise any potential harms, shocks or stresses which could impact that resilience. The first issue, obviously, whenever we talk about this topic, is what do we mean by resilience? There are a number of organisations and competing definitions for resilience. One is up there from the 100 Resilient Cities program. However, a common theme across all of these is viewing resilience through the lens or an awareness of an individual's health and well-being, and the importance of social connection and support as a contributor to that health and well-being. As part of this report, rather than working on redefining resilience, was interested in exploring a series of indicators which were developed to understand and identify what a mature, resilient community might look like. For the purpose of this report and this piece of work, the indicators were essentially categorised under 5 high-level categories. Each of these categories had a number of measures underneath them. These categories were development. So this was looking not exclusively, but largely at the physical infrastructure. So it was looking at almost fully developed neighborhoods, shopping and retail precincts, transport options, and access to that services in the physical infrastructure which supports services. It was the relational category, which is looking at the avenues to to sort of improving social isolation. So this was support services, programs, events, festivals, the ability of communities to really relate and individuals within a community to really relate to one another. Human capital, which was essentially people and building people within that community. So elements such as living and working locally. It was the educational attainment of the community, participation in education, labour market participation. It was actually building that individual strength within the community. Networks, which was the informal and formal opportunities for people to connect and participate. It had a strong relationship to the relational indicator, but it was identified there were a number of measures that were independent. And cohesion, which is a local ability to solve challenges. It was the concept of the community participating in its own planning, the community working together. And a really key measure under this was the increased tolerance of diversity. This was how resilience was defined for this project. And then this project was able to build upon those 5 categories and really dig down further into this concept of the emerging community. So the emerging community, in this sense, really looked at a community where the individual or the family or whoever is moving in starts with an absence of prior features of community. So we really look at this as being one of the key stages of development of a community, where a community may go through phases from planning into the early development, into the emerging, which is here, before proceeding into the maturer stage of community. For the purpose of this, one of the key features that was coming out of this report, and one of the key features that I'm sure almost everyone in this room is really aware of, is that emerging communities, particularly in growth areas, are often marked by a number of key indicators of vulnerability, or stresses or shocks that could impact resilience. So we know that there are high rates of psychological distress. There are major gaps in service provision. Residents often lack access to key services or support. And we know that one of the most significant things that happens in emerging and growth communities is that there's often a real lack of any kind of social support and social infrastructure to build that. And so what this report did is it took that concept of resilience that we saw in the slide before and considered the application of that to these new and emerging communities, and asked the key question of how do you actually build upon this knowledge of vulnerability and stresses, and how can you actually use tools and frameworks that are available to try to protect from these vulnerabilities and build resilience in these communities.
So I'm going to talk about following on from Nick talking about resilience and its connection to the planning framework. So the project showed the inadequacy of the planning framework and the planning tools in Victoria in ensuring that new communities are actually able to respond to land uses and other challenges which pose a threat to health, safety and well-being of our local communities. As Nick mentioned, residents in growth areas have more limited access to jobs, community services and facilities, and social connections which make them more vulnerable to certain land uses such as gambling venues, and that's something Nick's going to touch on as a case study a bit later. Whilst the planning system in Victoria generally recognises the importance of the early integrated delivery of various services and sustainable transport connections in contributing to community development, the planning tools do not always work together to ensure the best outcomes for our community. Furthermore, there is a disconnect about how these services contribute to building community capability and resilience. A new and emerging community will be more resilient earlier in its life if the planning and delivery of new homes is matched by the early and integrated delivery of well-considered range of services, facilities and supports. A more established community has greater capacity to absorb shocks and respond to new negative land use activities. And part of the task of this project has been to identify measures and indicators of a resilient community, which will assist local government and communities to make planning decisions as they apply to different communities. Whilst not having an understanding of how other states work in respect to the planning process, through this project, we have found that the Victorian planning system, there is an incomplete connection between resilience and harm minimisation in the planning scheme and the planning scheme's role in managing potentially harmful land use considerations. The gaps within the current planning framework in Victoria makes it challenging for local governments in advocating on behalf of our local communities and limits our realm of influence in responding to applications for those land uses which may harm the community. Nor does the planning system empower councils or local governments to make the best decisions for our community. The project outlines how the Victorian planning system can better support local councils to manage growth and build resilience in new growth areas by ensuring that key facilities, services and infrastructure are provided prior to the introduction of facilities that could negatively impact vulnerable communities. The report provides whole of government recommendations on the various tools and levers that can be relied upon by state and local government to deliver greater community resilience and the potential impact of those initiatives in minimising harm and promoting resilience in growth areas. The recommendations, among other things, seek to advance reform and change the overarching Planning Environment Act in order to recognise resilience and harm minimisation as an objective of planning in Victoria. There are other recommendations which extend to changes to planning policy and the zone provisions, and they also extend to non-legislative tools such as precinct structure plan guidelines, which are used in Victoria to guide development in growth areas. And we'd like you to think about whether your planning frameworks are assisting you to achieve the best community outcomes. And we'd certainly like to hear from you to better understand how your planning system might assist in communities being more resilient earlier in life in growth areas.
Thanks, Fiona. So as Fiona mentioned, this report utilised electronic gaming machines as a case study to understand how resilience could be incorporated within systems to help within the planning systems, essentially. So the report looked at the emerging pattern where, particularly in new and emerging communities in growth areas, electronic gaming venues appear to appear first or relatively early in the development of those communities. In particular, it noted that hotels with electronic gaming machines are becoming the first piece of community infrastructure in many of these communities across growth areas. It was identified that at the heart of this issue, as Fiona discussed a moment ago, and building upon that, there's an inconsistent approach to assessing, considering and applying resilience, vulnerabilities and or stresses between a series of different acts, bodies and organisations. And the planning framework in Victoria, it lacks the ability to empower decision makers to support resilience building within these communities. There are a number of identified reforms, but really at the heart of these reforms was the concept of empowering the system to consider resilience, empowering the decision makers in this system, and the fact that this empowerment would help to build stronger protections for vulnerable communities to ensure that they have protection and to help them build resilience prior to any electronic gaming machine venue coming into those new and emerging communities. And that really takes us to the core principle that this report built upon, which was that there is a need to empower the system to make more nuanced decisions and enable more sensitive outcomes. Whilst this report identified a series of potentially impactful changes that could be made to the Victorian planning system at all levels of government, this report really suggested that there's more that needs to be done. This report highlighted, this is an advocacy avenue for us in local government, but also across all arms of government, to be able to really work towards protecting and building this resilience in new and emerging communities. And as part of this, and this report really tried to do this, was learning from the examples of others across other states, but also really building upon the knowledge that's coming out of a number of sectors, and really trying to understand how we can help to support the communities at their earliest stages of development. As Fiona said, we would really like to hear for any questions from you, and we'd like, our three councils are committed to continuing to work on this concept. So it's one of those things where advocacy as a group is always going to be more impactful. So thank you for your time today, and we hope that you found this of great interest as we did. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Nick and Fiona, and absolutely, we did find it as interesting as you did, and I just love that sense of using the tools that are available or getting new tools in the toolbox to make sure some more sensitive and really equitable outcomes can be achieved. So well done on all of your work, thank you. And I've got some questions that I'll put to Rebecca during the panel session, but please, as you said, everyone listening, make contact with Nick and Fiona and Rebecca, because there's so much knowledge there and so much experience that we can all share and learn from. So please make that connection.